Hi guys, TotallyDubbed here, and today I'm doing a video review for the JBL Bar 5.1 surround. Now this isn't to be confused with the older JBL 5.1. Even though the naming is a bit confusing, the surround version, the one that I'm reviewing over here, is a bit cheaper. How much cheaper? Well, around £150 in the UK. The official price is around £550, however I found it for around £450. As such, I'll be reviewing it at the £450 price tag. In the US, it can be found for around $400, making it even more affordable. So without further ado, let's get into this review. So first off, I'd like to talk about connectivity. You've got a HDMI input, HDMI output for TV ARC, Ethernet, optical, and USB where you can also charge. There's also an 8-pin plug as well for power. The remote control that's included is pretty basic. You can see it over here. It's pretty lightweight and made out of plastic, and even though it's pretty large, it only provides a small variety of controls. And that's because the soundbar itself is somewhat limited. In other words, you haven't got complex EQ systems that you might find in the more expensive JBL soundbar or its competitors. Instead, you've got volume and also your inputs, and then also your bass adjustment, which goes between low, mid, and high. So moving on from that, let's talk about the build quality. Now, soundbar is made out of plastic. It's got a metal grille that's extended around the front and the side of the soundbar, and there is a massive 10-inch subwoofer that's also included. Now, both of these connect over the 8-pin connectors, so it's pretty easy to connect. As for the build quality and design, I've got no complaints whatsoever. It's also a pretty low-profile soundbar, as you might notice over here, so it should fit under your TV. As you can see over here, I've got the Samsung 55Q9FN, and over here I didn't have any issues in terms of visibility, whereas other soundbars are pretty thick and chunky and sometimes obstruct the view of the bottom edge of my TVs, and that's not the case with this JBL soundbar. Now, moving on from that, there is physical buttons which complement the actual remote control. So for example, if you were to ever lose a remote control, you can have the basic functions such as on and off, volume up and down, and also inputs. Now, in terms of the speaker array, you've got 5 speakers which are somewhat center weighted, so they're pretty much positioned in that sort of that distance, and then you've got 2 sideward firing speakers. So in other words, you've got 7 total speakers on the soundbar, and of course the one massive subwoofer, the 10-inch woofer on the right hand side or left hand side, depending on where you place it. I do find that the positioning of the speakers could have been a little bit better. For example, spacing out, let's say having 3 in the middle and 2 on the extremities, and then you've also got the sideward ones. Now, obviously it's JBL's decision in terms of design, but that's what they've decided to do. And it should be also mentioned that there's no top or upward firing speaker, so you don't get Dolby Atmos or similar. So moving aside from the build quality, I do also want to talk about the setup of the soundbar. It's really simple. Other than connecting it over HDMI, you might want to know that you can connect it over wireless as well. By wireless, I mean it's got Chromecast built in, so you'll need the Google Home app, and that's again pretty simplistic to do and very easy to set up. And also it should be mentioned that it's also got Bluetooth built in, so if you do wish to stream over your phone, you might not get the best sound quality, but if you just want simplicity, you've got Bluetooth built in as well. Now, there are a few hidden modes with this soundbar. By hidden modes, I mean they're not glaringly obvious or not really pointed out in a quick start guide when you get the soundbar. So if you do get the soundbar, I very much do encourage you to look at the full-length manual that you can find online, or alternatively, you just listen to what I'm going to be saying. First of all, it's the calibration. This has a built-in microphone, so unlike the JBL 5.1 soundbar, which has a separate module which allows you to calibrate it with your room, this has a built-in microphone. In other words, it will do its calibration by you initiating it. To initiate it is pretty simple. You hold down the HDMI button for around 3 to 5 seconds, and then it will automatically calibrate. Sometimes it might fail, and that is sometimes due to the fact that something is obstructing it. So when I first ran calibration, I found that the subwoofer unit was just sitting a little bit too close to the edge of my TV stand, and therefore the sideward firing speakers was, well, presumably hitting the subwoofer and therefore not getting that proper room calibration. So you'll want to make sure that you're not obstructing anything of the soundbar, but once that's done, it will take around about 30 odd seconds, and then you've got a calibrated soundbar, which is pretty nice to see because not many soundbars, specifically at this price range, offer any sort of room calibration whatsoever. Now, moving on from that, and something that I am accustomed to with a Samsung soundbar is the fact this has smart mode. Now, smart mode is essentially a way of upmixing stereo sound into a more 5.1 surround sound effect. Now, this has its advantages and disadvantages, and I'll get into that in just a bit with the sound quality section. But in order to access that, what you'll have to do is hold down the mute button on the remote control, then press the plus sound button on the volume key on the remote, and then that will enable or disable smart mode. So now let's go on to the performance of the soundbar. Now, as I mentioned before, it's got 7 speakers, 7 drivers, including the 10-inch woofer. That gives it a total output of 550 watts, which is plenty loud. Now I'm going to give you a little clip first, so you guys can actually hear the actual sound quality of soundbar, and then I'll reassess after that.
Sing, you know, I'm crawling, crawling, I am crawling, my way back to falling from so high, falling from so high, so high. The thing is my imagination is constantly racing.
So there you go, you had a little clip from one of my friends, Priya. Make sure you do check out her channel in the description below. Now, in terms of the audio that you'll be able to listen to, it's coming from my camera, and obviously it's being played back through your computer speakers or your headphones or earphones or your phone, whatever it might be that you're watching this video on. It's not going to be an accurate description or a representation of the soundbar, and for me to actually have that in terms of you guys listening to exactly what I hear to is pretty much near impossible unless you were to come here physically and listen to the soundbar. However, the purpose of this video is for me to give you my subjective opinions. Now, let's talk about the sound quality, and then I'll then move into the features such as Dolby Audio and then the smart mode that I alluded to before. So first of all, in terms of the sound quality, I will say that the subwoofer is absolutely overpowering and very, very loud. Even when dialed down to the low setting on the EQ, and as I mentioned before, it doesn't have a dedicated EQ, only the subwoofer can be dialed down from low, medium and high. I'll be very surprised if most people use it on medium or high. However, on low mode, it was still very much powerful and somewhat prominent when I was watching movies or listening to music. In this respect, the subwoofer does somewhat overpower the overall sound frequencies and is the dominant force of the soundbar. Now, I do understand that JBL wanted this to be a really powerful soundbar and something that is going to be very bass orientated, but I didn't expect it to be this much skewed towards the bass response. To give you an idea, the sub-bass does extend really well, whilst the mid-bass is somewhat uncontrolled and at times can sound a little bit wobbly. And that's not something you'd really want to be hearing when you're spending £550 or £450 on a soundbar. With that said, I should compare it to some of its competitors, and at this price tag you'll either find a standalone soundbar without a subwoofer altogether, or you'll find one that really doesn't have a good subwoofer altogether. So if you're looking for bass and you do love bass, be it in movies or music, then you'll appreciate the fact that this JBL soundbar actually does come with a huge subwoofer that you'll be placing next to your TV. Now, in terms of the bass response, it does overpower the mids. As I mentioned before, it does feel like it drowns them out, and I will say it's its weakest point. So when it comes to dialogue, or if you're going to be watching movies or even listening to the news, you'll find that the center channel really does try and channel all that dialogue through those speakers. And yet when there is somewhat of a bass response in the background, it will completely drown out all that dialogue and the mid-range, and therefore produce a somewhat subdued mid-range response. This came across when I was watching the news, came across when I was watching movies, and when I was listening to some of my favorite tracks. So in this respect, I will say that the soundbar and the subwoofer have this sort of flaw. In other words, the flaw is the fact that the mid-range is pretty recessed and pushed back and isn't its best quality. Moving on to the highs, I will say that the highs do somewhat roll off at the top end. It doesn't sound as extended and as crystal clear as you would want it to be. However, given its price tag, I can't complain too much. Other soundbars that I've come across at this price range that have a subwoofer included do struggle in terms of the mids and highs, and the JBL soundbar does a relatively better job in terms of the high-end reproduction. I will say that if you do spend more money, you're going to get much better high-end reproduction, and from what I'm aware, the JBL Soundbar 5.1, the non-surround one, which has removable tweeters, well, has tweeters, which are fantastic to see, whereas these ones have them somewhat built in on the side, which therefore isn't great when you're going to be watching movies and things and you want it to be forward-facing rather than sideward-facing, so it's worth bearing that in mind. Now, in terms of the soundstage and the overall surround sound experience, as I mentioned before, the smart mode does really help in terms of getting a more surround sound effect. It does have its advantages and disadvantages, however, and the biggest disadvantage is the fact that how it struggles to funnel dialogue through the central channels when you have a lot of action happening in the background. So if you remember the old school days where you used to dial up the volume when there is dialogue and then dial it down when there is action, well, smart mode on this JBL soundbar does have that sort of effect, so you're going to have to be playing around with the volume all the time. If you don't want to be doing that, I would highly suggest you to disable smart mode and therefore run it in its purest state. The issue with that is that it does affect the overall soundstage. It doesn't sound as full, it doesn't fill the room as much as you'd like it to do, and the side speakers don't come out as prominent as they should do. So despite it being called the 5.1 surround, it is only really in effect when you have smart mode enabled, and that's obviously when you have a stereo sort of input and you're wanting to upmix it to a 5.1 surround sound type of sound. So again, it depends on the content you're watching, and I just don't feel that it's really been done or executed really well with this JBL soundbar. I feel that smart mode could have been implemented a little bit better, or the fact that if you had EQ controls, you could dial up the mids and therefore the dialogue wouldn't have to sound so subdued when there's action happening in the background. And finally, to round off this section, I do want to mention about the Dolby audio sound. I did have Transformers that has Dolby Atmos support. As I mentioned before, this doesn't have Dolby Atmos due to it not having upward firing speakers, but Dolby audio was properly picked up and it was showing on my Samsung TV as well that the soundbar is receiving that via HDMI, and so it does work, and I can certify that it does have that compatibility. Also, as mentioned before, you do also have wireless connectivity, so if you do want to play sound over the air, then I would highly suggest you use Chromecast rather than Bluetooth, because you'll be losing less quality of detail of your MP3 or whatever tracks that you might have on your phone or your Spotify, for example, versus having to use Bluetooth, which will really degrade the quality of your music. So overall, what do I make of the soundbar? Well, it has its pros and cons, and as I mentioned before, there are certain things that I really like about the soundbar, but there's also certain things that I feel that could be improved. With that said, I have to be somewhat realistic, and rather than comparing it to a soundbar that costs twice its price, or even a soundbar that costs more than £200 more, I would say that this soundbar does a very good job at the £450 price tag. If you can find this soundbar for £450, or say $400 from, at the time of making this video, that is the price that I found, that is an incredibly good deal for this type of soundbar. It sounds pretty good, it's got a decent surround sound, and it's got a ridiculously good subwoofer which will literally shake your room if you want it to do. So it isn't the best soundbar I've come across. It's not one that I would definitely jump at. However, given the price that you'd be paying for it and what you're getting in the box, from the wireless setup to the connectivity to the build quality to your overall sound quality even, I would say it's definitely one that I would recommend. So there we have it. That's been my honest, unbiased, unpaid review. If you have liked this review and this video, make sure you give it a like, subscribe if you want to see more, favourite and share, and do let me know in the comments below if you've got any questions whatsoever, or if you were thinking about buying it or not, let me know as well. Do definitely check in the description below for alternative suggestions. As I mentioned before, I think you'll struggle to find a soundbar that has all of this in one package at this price, but nevertheless I will put in suggestions in there if you are interested in either spending more or saving a bit of money in order to sacrifice a bit of quality. So there we go guys, I've been Totally Dubbed, hopefully you've enjoyed it, take care and bye bye.